Hey everybody, this is a piece by Paresh Chattopadhyay titled The Soviet Question and Marx Revisited, a reply to Mike Haynes. Alright, let's go. Where am I? Okay. Mike Haynes who's important in this, obviously. According to International Socialist Review, it says Mike Haynes teaches globalization at the University of Wolverhampton, UK. He's the author of Nikolai Bukharin and the Transition from Capitalism to Socialism, Russia, Class Power in the 20th Century, and with J. Wolfries, edited the volume Revolution in the Modern World, published with Verso in 2007. Yeah, so it seems like he's affiliated with like international socialists. Maybe I'm wrong. All right, so here we go. I read with great interest Mike Haynes' criticism of my book, The Marxian Concept of Value in the Soviet Experience. No. The Marxian Concept of Capital in the Soviet Experience, which is available on libcom if you were curious. Just a little description of the book. This work establishes the uniqueness of the Marxian category of capital on the basis of the original text by Marx. The study has been neglected in the existing literature. The wage-labor relationship is shown to be necessary and sufficient for the existence of capitalism. Individual ownership is shown to be a particular form of capitalist private property, which can also take the form of collective ownership. The author argues the capitalist character of the Soviet economy. Back to the text. Mike Haynes' valuable and forceful criticisms concern, most importantly, three issues: the correct methodological approach to the Soviet economy, the nature of the revolution of 1917, and the nature of the Russian economy during the period from 1917 to 1928. The three sections of the present paper correspond to these three issues. The paper ends with a short conclusion. First section, USSR opposing approaches. Mike Haynes starts by questioning my studying the Soviet economy in abstraction from international economic relations. Haynes asks whether, quote, the USSR can be analyzed independently of its insertion in the world economy, end quote. In support of his position, Haynes cites Trotsky, quote, Marxism takes as its point of departure Marxism takes its point of departure from the world economy, end quote. Trotsky. Which, quote, Marxism is in question here? And, quote, point of departure, end quote, for what? If by, quote, Marxism, end quote, Trotsky means his own ideas or those of other, quote, Marxists, end quote, it does not bother me too much. For me, what is of singular importance is the position of Marx himself, whose stated objective was to, quote, reveal the economic law of motion of capital, end quote, and consequently to, quote, investigate the capitalist mode of production and the relations of production and exchange corresponding to it, end quote, Marx. Marx's explicitly stated, quote, point of departure, end quote, in relation to this fundamental objective is very different indeed. Thus, after stating that commodity is the, quote, elementary form of wealth, end quote, of bourgeois society, Marx adds, quote, therefore our investigation begins with the analysis of a commodity, end quote, Marx. Footnote. My emphasis. In the French edition of Capital, as well as in Capital's so-called sixth chapter, which is God, I can't even think of the name. Jesus Christ. Fuck. Now this is going to drive me insane. Jesus Christ. I have it on the channel. It's the part where it talks about, like, real and formal subsumption and whatnot. Anyway, back to the text. I think it's like the results of this production process as a whole. Might be sure. I'm not sure. The immediate results of the production process, I think, might be what it's called. I'm not sure. So, I don't like forgetting stuff like that, but it's okay. Where am I? End footnote. Marx nowhere refers to, quote, world economy, end quote, as his, quote, point of departure, end quote, for his investigation. Indeed, Marx, far from taking as the, quote, point of departure, end quote, capital on a world scale, specifically mentions in the French edition of Capital that his analysis of the genesis of capital and its subsequent development is in the context of a very small part of the globe, to wit, Western Europe, in which it was, again, only in one country, England, where the process of expropriation of the immediate producers, the foundation of capital, took place in a radical manner. Later in his letter to Ferenc Sulich, Marx emphasized this point. Thus, England being, quote, still now the classic location of the capitalist mode of production and the corresponding relations of production and exchange, end quote, served for Marx as the, quote, principal illustration, end quote, of his, quote, theoretical development, end quote. Though England's, quote, insertion into the world economy, end quote, was in all probability more dense than that of the than what the USSR's was, the former's, quote, national, end quote, capitalism, growing and establishing itself out of the original expropriation of its own immediate producers within its own socioeconomic context, could adequately illustrate Marx's ideas about capitalism without the need of taking the, quote, world economy as the point of departure, end quote. Haynes is, of course, right in saying that there is no, quote, national capital, end quote. It is indeed a contradiction in terms. Capital's aim being not use value but exchange value, and correspondingly, production for production's sake, capitalist production involves, quote, interlacing all peoples in the net of the world market, whence the international character of the capitalist regime, end quote. Marx. However, the entanglement of a country in the world market does not engender, nor does it determine, the specificity of its social relations of production, which is in question. Hence, in order to study the specific character of the process of genesis and development of capitalism, which takes place through the, quote, expropriation of the self-sustaining peasants and the self-sustaining peasants' transformation into wage laborers, end quote, within a country, conditioned by the country's history, taking the, quote, country's own color, end quote, and, quote, creating the country's home market, end quote, for its capital, it is necessary for methodological reasons to leave aside the foreign economic relations which do not really belong to this inner process, and would rather obfuscate it. Having said this, after I had analyzed the specific form of the social relation of production of the USSR, I did take account of its rivalrous competitive relations with the, quote, Western, end quote, capitalist countries, including the relevant quantitative data to which Haynes seems to have paid little attention. Haynes ascribes to me the idea that one could, quote, derive the basic features of capitalism from the activity of two enterprises competing with one another, end quote. Haynes. In its place, Mike Haynes wants, quote, a concept of capitalism as a larger totality, based on competitive relations across state boundaries, end quote, because, quote, to abstract from this is to abstract from the core process, end quote, of capitalism, which is a, quote, system in, quote, development, end quote. Haynes. First of all, I submit that, in this rather discursive, descriptive long essay, Haynes rarely makes clear the concepts he uses, most of all the central concepts like, quote, capital, parenthesis, capitalism, and, quote, competition of capitals. I start my book by devoting two full theoretical chapters clarifying the basic concepts rigorously, following Marx's text. Haynes' statements clearly show my basic difference with Haynes regarding, quote, capital and, quote, competition of capitals, end quote. According to Haynes, I do not, quote, derive, end quote, capital's basic features from competition of capitals, nor do I make the concept of capital dependent on the size of the geographical area. Competition of capitals itself is one of the, quote, basic features of capitalism, end quote, all of which arise from the, quote, inner nature of the capitalist mode of production itself, which shows capital's, quote, necessary tendency, end quote, its, quote, tendency to draw out, bracket, ausbinden, and bracket, infinitely the value of surplus labor, end quote. Thus the, quote, inner nature of capital, its essential determination, end quote, appears and is realized, end quote, in competition as the, quote, reciprocal interaction of many capitals, end quote. Marx. It is through competition that capital realizes surplus value after having produced it. Competition executes and realizes the, quote, inner laws of capital, but does not create them. Wishing to explain them simply from competition is to confess that one does not understand them. I'm going to repeat that because a lot of it was in italics. Quote, the inner laws of capital, competition executes and realizes the, quote, inner laws of capital, but does not create them or invent them. Wishing to explain the inner laws of capital simply from competition is to confess that one does not understand them, end quote. Hence, for competition of capitals to exist, it is necessary and sufficient that more than one unit of production based on, quote, free, end quote, wage labor exist and confront one another as functionally independent and competing commodity producers. Given these conditions, geography here plays no role whatsoever for the existence of the competition of capitals. Geography becomes important only insofar as the spatial extension of the operation of capital helps the realization of surplus value of individual capitals on a bigger scale. Quote, competitive relations across state boundaries, end quote, is relevant insofar as the competition between capitals takes place across the globe, irrespective of boundaries, given capital's free movement, which simply means the extension of competition already existing inside the boundaries, demonstrating that capital does not accept any spatial barrier to the realization of surplus value produced within the boundaries. Haynes also wants to posit a positive, quote, role of the state as part of the competitive process, end quote, and, quote, competitive leverage, end quote, as, quote, a mixture of economic, political, and military power, end quote. Haynes. This looks like a terrible mixing up of issues. The relevant question in connection with capital as a mode of production is the competition of capitals. The relevant question in connection with capital as a mode of production is the competition of capitals. Economic rivalry of the different independent units of production, striving for maximum profit, not to be mixed up with political military rivalry of states. Not to be mixed up with the political military rivalry of states. For one thing, the political military rivalry of states was very much present in Marx's days without his taking account of this rivalry while analyzing the competition of capitals. Indeed, this rivalry of states plays an important role insofar as each state promotes and helps the movement of, quote, national, end quote, capital across the globe and tries to obstruct the same movement for, quote, foreign, end quote, capital but it plays little role in the explanation of the existence of competition of capitals itself, and bringing in this element would only obstruct a clear view of capital's competitive process, and thereby the nature of capital itself, as a relation of production. Footnote. Conceiving competition of capitals, as Haynes does, as something imposed on the USSR by the, quote, global economy, end quote, from outside, acting like a demiurgos, seems to be a way of escaping the dilemma. On the one hand, characterizing the USSR as capitalist, which would imply the existence of autonomous units of capital competing with one another, while on the other hand, denying the autonomy of the units of production in the USSR on the basis of the assumption of the single state ownership over the means of production. The, quote, orthodox, end quote, Trotskyists seem not to face up to this dilemma by their consistent denial of the existence of capitalism in the USSR. Again, I'm not sure that you could say that Haynes is an orthodox Trotskyist. And this is why the history of ideas, because I think that Haynes is coming from a Tony Cliff world. Can't be sure of that, but back to the text. That's why it's important to be able to. I think it's important to be able to make distinctions amongst varying tendencies. You know, they're not all the same. Where am I? When state enterprises compete with, quote, private, end quote, enterprises inside or outside of a country as their economic rivals, they do so as units of capital. Observing the rules of capitalist game and not as units of a state. Haynes refers to the, quote, core process, end quote, of capitalism. Now, quote, core, end quote, signifies the hard essential part of fruits containing seeds. If the, quote, core process signifies fundamental process, then capitalism's core process is the historically specific process of the separation of the immediate producers from the conditions of production, and the development of capitalism as a, quote, system is simply the enlarged reproduction of this separation, where capital, naturally, does not accept any barrier. To explain this, quote, core process, end quote, what is relevant is not so much the extension of the geographical area as the expansion of what Marx calls the, quote, home market, end quote. And this is important because just a thought to myself. This is making me think of Ellen Mason's Woods, because I was just reviewing some of her work recently, and she talks about how, like, the existence of trade, or like the profit on arbitrage, or like profit on alienation, right? Like buying something one place and moving it and selling it somewhere else. That kind of capital circuit is not sufficient to characterize economies where that is present, even on some large level, as capitalist. What is fundamentally necessary is the expropriation of the direct producers from their means of subsistence and rendering them market dependent. And even prior to that, making independent, self-sustaining peasant units become market dependent, right? Be like transitioning from, say, becoming peasants to being market dependent farmers, with varying degrees of largeness. But she makes a... Sorry, I feel like I'm not saying words. What I'm saying, though, is that she emphasizes the necessity of the home market for capitalism to be said to exist, right? And I think this is kind of like a big thing, is that with like Cliff's analysis, is that the Soviet Union, being part of the capitalist world system, is forced to compete with the capitalist world both economically and militarily, and thus causing it to take on capitalist characteristics at home, which would include obviously exploiting the living dog shit out of the direct producers, and in order to create a huge military industrial machine, which may be the case empirically. However, that is not sufficient to say that capitalism is in existence in the USSR. I think, if capitalism, there would have to be internal processes that are characteristic of. There'd have to be internal competition, right? Of this home market. I think that's what Paresh Chattopadhyay tries to say, is that there is indeed, was indeed a home market in the USSR. But I haven't read this book in a little while, so I'm not sure. Anyway, this is just making me think of the Ellen Mason's emphasis on the home market as what constitutes a capitalist mode of production. Anyway, to explain this, quote, core process, what is relevant is not so much the extension of the geographical area as the expansion of what Marx calls the, quote, home market, end quote. Following the, quote, Cliff formulation, end quote, of considering the Soviet economy as a, quote, single workshop, end quote, Haynes is, quote, puzzled, end quote, by my argument that the Soviet enterprises had, quote, effective control, end quote, over their operation and thereby acted as competing capitalists, adding a contrario that they enjoyed only, quote, constrained freedom, end quote. There's a footnote here that I missed. Conceiving competition of capitals as Haynes does as something imposed on the USSR. Wait. Oh shit, I already read that one. Sorry, I didn't miss that, sorry. End quote, Haynes. Let me first remark that the, quote, single workshop, end quote, argument would automatically, following Marx, contradict the reality of commodity production and, given wage labor, the corresponding competition of capitals in the USSR. In order to maintain the capitalist character of the USSR, this contradiction is ingeniously overcome by assuming that this whole process was simply imposed on the USSR from outside by the, quote, global economy, end quote, in order to be, quote, transmitted internally, ... by the center, end quote, exclamation point. The exclamation point is from Chattopadhyay. The quote is from Haynes. The, quote, puzzle, end quote, evaporates as soon as we realize that for competition of capitals to exist, the relations between, quote, center and particular units of production is of little importance. It is not a question of center versus unit. It is a question of unit versus unit. I'll repeat that again, because there's an italics. It is not a question of center versus unit. It is a question of unit versus unit. What is fundamental is the functional autonomy of each unit in relation to the others, independently of the question of the juridical ownership of the means of production and the question of control from the, quote, center. It should be stressed that the essential reality of capitalism is social capital as a totality. It should be stressed that the essential reality of capitalism is social capital as a totality. Social total capital has a, quote, real existence different from particular capitals, end quote. A particular capital constitutes only a, quote, autonomized, verselbständige, verselbständiges fraction of social total capital, just as each individual capitalist is only an element of the capitalist class, end quote. Marx. Hence, each single capital, as an organic part of the social total capital, is dependent by definition on the latter. the total social capital. But the singular capitals themselves are reciprocally independent. But the single capitals themselves are reciprocally independent, and as such, quote, confront one another as competing commodity producers, end quote. Marx. Capitalism in the USSR was not an exception to this rule. The enterprises were, of course, under the thumb of the, quote, center, end quote, that is, total social capital juridically owned by the party state. But, as fragments of this totality, they confronted one another as autonomous units based on wage labor, whose products took commodity form. Their chiefs, though not juridically owning the means of production, were the, quote, bearers, or, quote, functionaries of capital, end quote, in Marx's profound sense, and, quote, as brother enemies shared the booty of the appropriated labor, so that on average the one appropriated as much unpaid labor as the other, end quote. And, quote, competition is nothing but the striving of the individual capitalists to divide among themselves the quantity of the unpaid surplus labor that the capitalists together have squeezed, bracket, auspressen, end bracket, out of the working class, end quote. Marx. In Marx, we find a telling example of competition of capitals without there being a separate owner of each capital. In Marx, we find a telling example of competition of capitals without there being a separate owner of each capital. 5 separate capitals, quote, belong to one man, end quote, that is, as fractions of, quote, one single capital, end quote, competing with one another and sharing the total surplus value among themselves, each one, quote, getting one's distinct aliquot part, end quote.
Aliquot.
Aliquot is actually how you say that. A portion of a larger whole, especially a sample taken for chemical analyses or other treatment. Divide a whole into aliquots without taking aliquots from a whole. Back to the text. But in a somewhat different way, the, quote, puzzle, end quote, disappears as soon as we understand capital's totality-singularity configuration, quote, neither recognized nor understood by the usual, ordinary political economy, end quote, and set ourselves free from the juridical ownership fixation. It should be mentioned that inside the USSR itself, voices were raised questioning the, quote, single workshop, end quote, image of the Soviet economy. The very significant contribution in this respect we find in the unduly neglected Soviet economist V.P. Skredov, who, already in the 1960s, following Marx's ideas closely, battled the Soviet establishment economists for, quote, mixing up the economic and juridical relations, end quote, and faulted their conceptualization of, quote, property as a, quote, separate relation, independent of the historically determined forms of social production, end quote. I'm going to see if because I've tried to look up V.P. Skredov before. Oh, wait. Historic on Materialism appears to have a little bio of him. And who wrote this? An Alexander Y. Chepurenko. Well, it might look like a little too long to read for a thing. I don't know. How many paragraphs is it? Yeah, it's a little long. But let's see if there's anything on German Wikipedia. No, I can't find anything. Anyway, back to the text. VP Skredov affirmed the reality of relative reciprocal independence of the Soviet enterprises based on the, quote, existence of commodity relations within the state sector, end quote. Skredov. Returning to the theme 2 decades later in the context of the Gorbachev reform of the law of enterprises, Skredov affirmed the reciprocal separateness and relative independence of the Soviet enterprises, and specifically ridiculed the image of, quote, Soviet socialism as one giant factory, end quote. Where am I? I'm just going to read a paragraph from the Wikipedia page on perestroika on reform of the law of enterprises. In July 1987, the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union passed the law on state enterprise. The law stipulated that state enterprises were free to determine output levels based on demand from consumers and other enterprises. Excuse me, allergies. Enterprises had to fulfill state orders, but enterprises could dispose of the remaining output as the enterprises saw fit. However, at the same time, the state still held control over the means of production for these enterprises, thus limiting their ability to enact full cost accountability. Enterprises bought input from suppliers at negotiated contract prices. Under the law, enterprises became self-financing. That is, they had to cover expenses, wages, taxes, supplies, and debt service through revenues. No longer was the government to rescue unprofitable enterprises that could face bankruptcy. Finally, the law shifted control over the enterprise operations from ministries to elected workers' collectives. Gosplan's responsibilities were to supply general guidelines and national investment priorities, not to formulate detailed production plans. Back to the text. Returning to the theme 2 decades later in the context of the Gorbachev reform of the law of enterprises, VP Skredov reaffirmed the reciprocal separateness and relative independence of the Soviet enterprises, and specifically ridiculed the image of, quote, Soviet socialism as one giant factory, end quote. New section. The Russian Revolution. Haynes ascribes to me the ideas that, quote, Russia remained substantially unchanged after 1917, end quote, and that I, quote, wrote the popular base of the Russian Revolution out of history, end quote, and that I ignored the, quote, authentic, end quote, character of the popular revolution in 1917, where the Bolsheviks gained mass support. The first point is a palpable misrepresentation of my position. A contrario, I speak specifically of, quote, pre-capitalist, quote, semi-feudal, end quote, Russia, which the Bolsheviks inherited, and of the development of capitalism under their rule right from 1917. As regards my alleged, quote, writing the popular basis of the revolution out of history, end quote, I would hold, on the contrary, that this phrase, far from representing my position, perfectly represents the position of, quote, communism's false brothers, end quote, in Russia, to cite Marx's phrase. The Bolsheviks, in the first place, more on this below. Let me elaborate somewhat on the, quote, Russian Revolution. This rather bland expression short-circuits two qualitatively different moments of the revolutionary process that emerged in Russia in 1917, February and October. The revolutionary mass upsurge in February sallied forth spontaneously without any organized direction from above. As Trotsky writes in his monumental history, quote, "The February Revolution was begun from below. Nobody summoned the masses from above to insurrection," end quote. The first Soviets arose immediately after the political victory, towards the end of the famous, quote, 5 days, end quote, February 23rd to 7th, and spread rapidly all across Russia. This was again a spontaneous mass phenomenon of the workers and soldiers. It was some time before the peasants, without any directive from above again, launched the agrarian revolutionary movement whose basis was the old demand for the transfer to the, quote, people, end quote, the ownership of land. And this meant the expropriation and distribution of lands belonging to the crown, the state, the church, and the landlords. The Peasants' Insurrection acted as a powerful lever to the Bolshevik seizure of power in October. Peasant Soviets came later. Additionally, the Soviet movement comprised more than these two kinds. The inaugural moment of the Russian Revolution in February 1917, initiated and dominated by Russia's toilers without any party guidance, had all the basic features of the great popular revolutions of the past, such as those of 1789 to 93 and 1871 in France. Targeting mainly the pre-capitalist social order, this revolution started out as an immense democratic mass movement in an open-ended plural revolutionary process, which the different political parties increasingly tried to bring under control, advancing their own agenda as the agenda of the toilers. In fact, the demands of the workers emanating from the factory committees in March 1917 mainly concerned their economic conditions of existence, an 8-hour working day, higher wages, better sanitary conditions, and opposition to peace rates. As to their political demands, they wanted most of all a democratic republic and the convening of the Constituent Assembly. In their turn, the peasants wanted most of all the seizure of land of the state and the landlord, not nationalization. And as to their political demands, they wanted a democratic republic and a rapid and equitable peace. To the extent that the Russian laborers aimed above all at the destruction of the pre-capitalist institutions of the country, February inaugurated a bourgeois revolution in a vast context of mass spontaneity and initiative with a plural character. How very different was the, quote, second stage of the revolution, end quote, as Lenin called it in April 1917. From a tiny party of 20-odd thousand, in the spring of 1917, the Bolsheviks grew to a gigantic party of 300,000, obtaining a majority in many Soviets, most importantly in the big urban and industrial centers by October. The Bolsheviks continuously gained popular support because, more than most other parties, the Bolsheviks could sense the profound revolutionary strivings of the increasingly radicalized workers and captured in their popular slogan, quote, land, bread, freedom, end quote, formulated by Lenin in early March. What the workers wanted. Lenin well understood the very close links, infinitely stronger than the influence of his party, connecting the workers and soldiers to the Soviets. With the formula of the Bolshevik program, quote, all power to the workers and poor peasants, end quote, Lenin united the popular formula, quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote. Footnote. Ann Wheeler, 1958, quote, offering their party as a vehicle for the most uncompromising popular demands, the Bolsheviks were rewarded with a great spurt of growth, end quote. Ann Wheeler. C. Daniels, 1967. End footnote. Indeed, whatever I have said in my book about the 1917 events in no way contradicts either the, quote, authenticity or the, quote, popular character of the revolution, end quote, or the increasing, quote, mass support, end quote, for the Bolsheviks who undoubtedly, quote, counted on ruling by mass support, end quote. Haynes. What I have contested, without elaborating, is the contention of the proletarian character of the revolution, of the mass character of the Bolshevik seizure of power, and the claim of establishing a proletarian dictatorship. What I have contested without elaborating is the contention of the proletarian character of the revolution, of the mass character of the Bolshevik seizure of power, and the claim of establishing a proletarian dictatorship. It could not be a proletarian socialist revolution, at least not in the sense of Marx, in the absence of the necessary material and subjective conditions. As to the material conditions in which the country was summoned to plunge into, quote, socialist revolution, end quote, with only 1/6 of the population living in urban areas, quote, the conditions of rural life and the whole labor process remained at a level which prevailed at some earlier century in Western Europe, maybe at the level of French rural life sometime in the 16th century, end quote. Moshe Lewin, page 52. Footnote, Let Lewin, 1985, Prokopovich, 1952, Davies, 1991, end footnote. I think that actual quote is Lewin, though. Again, the economic historians have found little support for Lenin's contention about irreconcilable class antagonisms in the countryside of the epoch between petty capitalist, quote, kulaks and poor peasants and hired laborers. In fact, in 1913, the share of rural households relying mainly on hired labor counted for less than 0.1%, and landless rural proletarian engaged only in hired labor barely existed. This is like a very important thing. This is corroborated also by John Eric. I believe it's corroborated by... Now I feel like I'm talking my ass, but I'm feeling pretty confident in this. John Eric Merritt's essay on the left opposition and Stalinism and all that stuff talks about how, like, capitalism did not penetrate into Russian agriculture at the point of the October Revolution. And this seems to corroborate this. Actually, I'm going to copy this down. So forgive me. Sorry. It's just taking longer than I thought it would. Sorry. God, this is annoying. God. Sorry about that. So let me repeat that. Again, the economic historians have found little support for Lenin's contention about irreconcilable class antagonism in the countryside of the epoch between petty capitalist, quote, kulaks and poor peasants and hired laborers. In fact, in 1913, the share of rural households relying mainly on hired labor counted less than 0.1%, and a landless rural proletariat engaged only in hired labor and agriculture barely existed. In short, there seems to be little evidence to support the view of a full-blooded differentiation in the peasantry in the period before 1914. As regards the industrial proletariat working dominantly under foreign capital, it constituted barely 2% of the total population. Even abstracting from the absence of the material conditions, in a situation of socio-economic backwardness, and considering only the subjective factor, Lenin himself stated in 1919 that Russia's, quote, laboring masses, end quote, being at a, quote, low cultural level, end quote, were, quote, incapable of participating in the country's administration, end quote. If we take the October seizure of power, an extremely negligible part of the industrial proletariat, itself a drop in the vast ocean of the population, really participated in it, as confirmed by most historians. The October insurrection in no way signified a real popular uprising, with the active participation of the toiling masses, in sharp contrast with February. Trotsky writes on October, quote, the final act of the revolution seems too brief, too dry, too businesslike. There is no action of the great masses. There is no action of the great masses, end quote, Trotsky. There's a footnote that I missed. It says, for a rigorous and detailed critique of Lenin's thesis of the differentiation of peasantry in Russia, see Luva, 1984. Most people in Petrograd were unaware that this, quote, popular, end quote, insurrection was taking place. Quote, even the members of the provisional government did not see that power had already slipped from their hands, end quote. Trotsky. A well-known historian summed up the evidence. Quote, what, bracket, the insurrection, end bracket, amounted to was just a changing of guards in front of a series of buildings, usually with some arguments or a bit of token resistance, end quote. Moore Jr., 1978, end footnote. Lenin, while openly proclaiming, quote, all power to the Soviets, end quote, had in fact no faith that the Soviets could wield power. This is clear from Lenin's pronouncements of the period. With a tiny minority in the Soviets in June, Lenin declared that his party was already to take power by itself, adding in August that once in power his party would not leave it. Even when his party commanded a majority in the Soviets of the principal urban centers, Lenin showed his deep distrust of, if not utter disdain for the Soviet democratic process. Quote, waiting for the Soviet Congress, end quote, he affirmed, would be, quote, utter idiocy, sheer treachery, a childish and disgraceful game of formalities, and a betrayal of the revolution, end quote, Lenin. Ultimately, in conformity with this Leninist position, power was seized by the Bolsheviks on the decision of a handful of persons, independently of the toilers' organs of self-rule and behind their backs. In fact, quote, not from Kerensky, but from the Soviets, end quote. Taylor, 1977. Indeed, far from being the workers' own creation, the, quote, Bolshevik Party was Lenin's creation, ... Lenin was irreplaceable as the party's leader, ... When sharp differences arose, bracket, about the seizure of power, end bracket, Lenin's threat to resign from leadership was more effective than all other arguments, end quote. Medvedev. That the October seizure of power had nothing to do with the toiling masses seizing power on their own collective initiative, a la 1871 Commune, comes out starkly in Trotsky's statement in his Diary in Exile, quote, if neither Lenin nor I had been present in 1917 in Petersburg, there would have been no October Revolution, end quote. Trotsky. If this is the reality of the October Revolution, passing for a, quote, proletarian revolution, end quote, then it's clear that it was Lenin and his comrades themselves who were, in Haynes' words, quote, writing the popular base of the Russian Revolution out of history, end quote. It is clear from Trotsky's own account that even the ardent supporters of the Bolsheviks, including the party members, wanted the seizure of power by the Soviets, not by the party. Quote, the idea of a Bolshevik monopoly of power never crossed the minds of the overwhelming majority, end quote. Shapiro, 1960. The last demic obstacle on the Bolsheviks' road to power was the Constituent Assembly, the convening of which the Bolsheviks had been loudly championing till the seizure of power, and in fact even immediately after this victory. October 26th. Lenin reaffirmed this stand and added that even if the socialist revolutionaries were elected there as the majority, the Bolsheviks would accept it. However, when the assembly met at the beginning of January 1918 on the basis of, quote, Russia's first, last, and only universal, free, and democratic election, end quote, Daniels, with the SRs, the Socialist Revolutionaries, gaining absolute majority, the body was declared, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote, by the Bolsheviks and their allies and was dissolved by the government on the initiative of Lenin. Quote, 6 months later, every political party but the Bolsheviks, had been outlawed. Terror had commenced, and the new phenomenon of totalitarian dictatorship was beginning to take over the future of Russia, end quote. Daniels. After the initial period of, quote, triumph and the post-war massive demobilization and rapid socioeconomic decline of the country in winter 1918, workers' dissatisfaction with the nouveau regime began to grow rapidly with increasing protests and demonstrations by thousands against the authorities. Quote, a third stage began to unfold in the Bolshevik labor relations, leading to open conflict, repression, and the consolidation of the dictatorship over the proletariat. End quote. Rosenberg, 1987. At a, quote, extraordinary meeting on the 3rd of March 1918, the delegates of the biggest factories of Petrograd, railway workshops, electric power stations, printing presses said in a declaration sent to the All-Russian Congress of Soviets that, quote, we, the workers of Petrograd, in our majority have accepted the change of regime effected in October in, quote, our, end quote, name, without our knowledge and without our participation. Without our knowledge and without our participation. The new power declares itself as the government of workers and peasants, promised to realize our will and respect our interest. After 4 months, we see that a laughing stock has been made of our faith, our hopes, and trampled underfoot, end quote. Quoted from Heller and Nekrek, 1982. Quote, the turn of the masses away from the Bolsheviks, end quote, as Medvedev calls it, was shown in the elections to the Soviets in spring and summer 1918. The Bolsheviks were losing ground. People's dissatisfaction with the installed power reached new heights toward the end of the Civil War in 1920-21, coming to the fore in different urban centers. It had particular breadth and intensity in Petrograd, especially in the factories, earlier Bolshevik strongholds. Even boots were not delivered to the Red Army soldiers lest they join the demonstrators. Quote, February 1921 in Petrograd astonishingly reminded one of February 1917, end quote. Heller and Nekrek, 1982.
Referring to the situation globally, Isaac Deutscher writes that, quote, the bulk of the working class, not to speak of the peasantry, unmistakably turned against the Bolsheviks. If the Bolsheviks had now permitted free elections to the Soviets, the Bolsheviks had now permitted free elections to the Soviets, the Bolsheviks would almost certainly have been swept from power, end quote. Deutscher. The last scene in the drama of, quote, writing, end quote, the people, quote, out of history, end quote, was enacted in Kronstadt in February to March 1921. Footnote. Perhaps the best documented book on Kronstadt is by the noted historian Israel Getzler, on whose account the following is largely based. See also Wade, 1993, for a brief review of the documents. End footnote. Reacting to the Petrograd events and in view of the widespread repression of the regime in response to the popular grievances, the soldiers, sailors, and workers of Kronstadt, at a meeting of about 15,000 on the 1st of March 1921, adopted, quote, almost unanimously, end quote, a 15-point resolution demanding, among other things, new elections to the Soviets by secret ballot, freedom of speech, press, and assembly for the toilers, as well as all left organizations, liberation of all political prisoners of the left parties and the toilers, peasants' right to cultivate their own land without hired labor. The Bolsheviks denied all legitimacy to the demands and denounced the movement as counter-revolutionary and led by white generals, for which, of course, there was no shred of evidence. Lenin himself admitted at the 11th Party Congress that, quote, they did not want the whites and they did not want our power either, end quote. However, quote, it was essential for the Communist Party to suppress the idea of Kronstadt, which defended the idea of a, quote, third revolution, end quote, end quote. Daniels. Thus ended the, quote, Red Kronstadt, end quote, which had, quote, produced a bustling, self-governing, egalitarian, and highly politicized Soviet democracy, the like of which had not been seen in Europe since the days of the Paris Commune, end quote. Getzler. New section. Russia 1917-28. Criticizing me, Haynes observes that it makes little sense to present the new economic policy era Russia as, quote, a simple expression of capitalism, end quote. That there was, quote, no immediate ascendancy of capitalism in Russia, end quote, between 1917 and 1928, and that rather there was, quote, a complex array of forces, end quote. Haynes. This refusal to face reality seems strange inasmuch as Lenin himself asserted at the party's 8th Congress in 1918 that, quote, even in Russia, capitalist commodity economy exists, is functioning and developing, end quote. And in more than one text of the period, Lenin affirmed the desirability of the development of capitalism in Russia. The desirability of the development of capitalism in Russia, at least, quote, to some extent and for some time, end quote, of course under the, quote, proletarian, end quote, state. The reality of the period of 1917 to 28 vindicated Lenin's position. A government decree of 10th of September 1921 described the wages system as a fundamental factor of industrial development. Described the wages system as a fundamental factor of industrial development. Wages and employment being considered as a matter of relation based on freely consented contract between the workers and the concerned enterprise. Quote, in less than a year, the new economic policy had reproduced the characteristic essentials of a capitalist economy, end quote. E.H. Carr. The data also support this. Thus, while the share of independent commodity producers in handicrafts and agriculture in the total population, including non-working dependents, remained constant at 75% between 1924 and 1928, the share of, quote, workers and employees, end quote, that is, wage and salary earners, rose from 15% to 18% between the two dates. As a particular indicator of the early phase of capitalist development, I could note that, in metallurgy and coal mining, the share of workers originating from the peasant families increased from an average of 43.4% from 1918 to 25 to 53.5% in 1926 to 27. Taking industrial production as a whole, its index rose from 39.5 in 1922 to 23, and to 119.6 in 1927 to 28. The number of industrial workers doubled, increasing from 1.4 million to 2.8 million during the same period. The total value output of large-scale industry at 1926 to 27 prices grew from 1.9 milliard in 1921 to 15.7 milliard in 1928. The development of the industrial economy was, of course, based on wage labor. As an index to, quote, qualitative change after 1928, end quote, which I allegedly neglected to deal with, Haynes stressed that the post-1928 regime found it, quote, necessary to clear out factory committees, and to turn trade unions into transmission belts, end quote. I would submit that the factory committees were firmly set on the road of being, quote, cleared out, end quote, and the trade unions turned into, quote, transmission belts, end quote, in the pre-1928 period, the process initiated by Lenin himself. On the 26th/27th of October 1917, the, quote, Project of Rules on Workers' Control, end quote, composed by Lenin, laid down that the decision of the elected representatives of workers could be cancelled by trade unions and their Congress. Point 5. And that, in all enterprises of state importance, the owners as well as the representatives of workers would be answerable to the state for maintaining order and discipline and for protecting property. Point 6. In February 1918, a joint meeting of the factory committees and the trade unions agreed upon the subordination of the former to the latter. Indeed, the Bolsheviks saw for the first time the danger of radical democracy. Confronting them at the level of enterprise, following literally Lenin's earlier words on workers' self-administration through factory committees. To help themselves, the Bolsheviks called on the trade unions where they now had a majority. The trade unions not only prevented the convening of the All-Russian Congress of Factory Committees, but also simply annexed them as their lowest level organ. This process of, quote, clearing out the factory committees, end quote, has to be studied along with the measures undertaken in parallel by the authorities to, quote, discipline, end quote, labor, such as forced labor camps, one-person management, the Taylor system, piece wages, labor books. Footnote, E. H. Carr, 1963. At the Ninth Party Congress in 1920, Lenin spoke about the necessity of fighting against, quote, notorious democratism, end quote, and of the need to sweep away, quote, all these shoutings against appointees, all this old pernicious trash, end quote, Lenin. As to the trade unions, they were already, quote, turned into transmission belts, end quote, by none other than Lenin himself. Thus repeating and elaborating what he said about 1 year earlier, Lenin, in a draft resolution on the trade unions on the 12th of January 1922, compared the trade unions as, quote, the transmission belts from the Communist Party to the masses, end quote, with transmission belts linking motors and machines. Dobb notes that, by the beginning of the 1920s, quote, the trade unions had come to be looked upon as little different from any ordinary State Department, end quote. Dobb. New section. Conclusion. Towards the end of his life, Marx had envisaged the possibility of the rise of a higher form of society in Russia by skipping the capitalist stage, provided that the process of decomposition of its rural communes, already started by the Tsarist policies, could be thwarted by a popular revolution in the country against Tsarism, coinciding with a proletarian revolution in Western Europe. However, by 1917, Russia's rural communes were sufficiently decomposed, coupled with the non-occurrence of a proletarian revolution in the West, in spite of some cases of armed uprising, notably in Germany, by a minority of the working class, viewed by Lenin and Trotsky as the beginning of a proletarian revolution. virtually excluding such a possibility. In this situation, there remained for Russia only the second possibility envisaged by Marx. Russia could realize its total transformation only by traversing, quote, all the vicissitudes of the capitalist regime, end quote. In other words, in this situation, it is only the development of capitalism which would create the, quote, material conditions of existence, end quote, of the new society. As opposed to Marx's materialist perspective, Lenin and Trotsky advanced the thesis of the possibility of socialist revolution breaking out in a backward capitalist country, the, quote, weakest link, end quote, in the chain of world capital, contrary to what Marx had thought. This, quote, weakest link, end quote, argument became a canon of the dominant left, beginning at least with Gramsci. I don't really know the exact arguments about it, but I think what's his name, James D. White, who's kind of like an authority on Marxism in Russia, says that, I believe he says that Lenin didn't accept the weakest link in the chain theory. So it would make sense that it wouldn't be a canon until Gramsci. But I'm not sure. However, Lenin and Trotsky dismissed Marx too rapidly. Lenin quickly realized that there was no other way to go forward to, quote, catch up and surpass the, end quote, the advanced capitalist countries, to use his expression of September 1917, but precisely through the development of capitalism in a largely pre-capitalist country, where there was no possibility of the rise of socialism for a long time to come. The measures undertaken by the new regime, as well as Lenin's own pronouncements of the period, clearly showed that Russia was following the capitalist path. Footnote. Outside of Russia, within the Leninist tendency, Bordiga seems to have been the only one who understood this. End footnote. This only confirmed Marx's profound materialist prognosis. Quote, if in the society as it is, we do not find in a latent bracket Verhult and bracket form the material conditions of production and corresponding relations of circulation for a classless society, all attempts at exploding it would be Don Quixotism, end quote. Marx indeed had the last laugh. I want to see, now that's the end of the piece. I'm going to look up some of these references, these books that are referenced. The first is Alexander Baykov's The Development of the Soviet Economic System, an essay on the experience of planning in the USSR at National Institute of Economic and Social Research and Social Studies. Yeah, I'm not seeing any book description for that. Franz Borkenau, I see him all the time. Franz Borkenau, World Communism. Yeah, I'm not seeing any descriptions of that book either. But according to Wikipedia, Franz Borkenau lived from 1900 to 1957, was an Austrian writer. Borkenau was born in Vienna, Austria, the son of a civil servant As a university student in Leipzig, his main interests were Marxism and psychoanalysis. Birkenau is known as one of the pioneers of the totalitarianism theory. E.H. Carr, I'm sure a lot of you know who E.H. Carr is. E.H. Carr, Edward Hallett Carr, who lived from 1892 to 1982, was a British historian, diplomat, journalist, and international relations theorist, and an opponent of empiricism within historiography. Carr was best known for a history of Soviet Russia, a 14-volume history of the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1929, for his writings on international relations, particularly the 20 Years' Crisis, and his book, What is History, in which he laid out historiographical principles rejecting traditional historical methods and practices. Educated at the Merchant Taylors' School, London, and then at Trinity College, Cambridge, Carr began his career as a diplomat in 1916. 3 years later, he participated at the Paris Peace Conference as a member of the British delegation, becoming increasingly preoccupied with the study of international relations and of the Soviet Union. Carr resigned from the Foreign Office in 1936 to begin an academic career. From 1941 to 46, Carr worked as an assistant editor at the Times, where he was noted for his editorials urging a socialist system and an Anglo-Soviet alliance as the basis of a post-war order. Yeah, I feel like this isn't actually a good idea to try to read through all these sources in an audiobook. So I'm just going to end it here. Thank you for listening.